Thank you for that very nice introduction. As you can tell, I do a lot of very strange things in my professional life that kind of conglomerate around something central, but are kind of interesting in their own ways. I'm really excited to be here talking to you about a topic that I've been thinking a lot more about the last year or two, and probably a topic that many of you have at least wondered once in your life. Why is it that we are fascinated by true crime? But before we start talking about death and serial killers and all things terrible, let's start with something a little nicer, a little more pleasant. These are the Otzi Alps on the border of Austria and Italy, probably one of the most beautiful places in the world. Attracts lots of hiking tourists because of its natural beauty. And in 1991, a pair of German hikers were there, and they were at an elevation of about 10,000 feet, which I assume looked something like this. An elevation at which you don't really expect to find anyone else around you. But off in the distance, they spotted a man who appeared to be alone, and thinking he might be in trouble because hiking at that elevation alone is kind of a risky thing to do, they walked over towards his location. Now, when they get to him, they realize they were too late. This man had already perished on the mountaintop. But what they didn't realize is that he had been dead for over 5,000 years. So they had found the body of and I promise this will tie into true crime eventually. They found the body of a Copper Age man who's now affectionately referred to as Otzi the Iceman. You may have heard about him. He's been published in a lot of National Geographic magazines, Time magazine, and he's been around for about 30 years, and we continually find new stuff out about him. And when there's a new big discovery about Otzi, it usually gets a lot of press. Now, because his body was so well preserved, we've learned quite a bit about Otzi over the past 30 or so years through forensic, genetic, and archaeological analysis. For example, we learned that Otzi did not have the easiest life. His teeth were riddled with cavities. He had intestinal parasites, frostbite on his toes. He had broken his ribs and his nose at one point in his life. And even though he had never eaten any fast food, poor old Otzi even had signs of heart disease and hardened arteries. Otzi's belongings were also found near him, and they were also very well preserved. And he had quite a survival kit with him. He had auric leather shoes, he had leggings, he had 2 different coats made of sheep and goat hide, he had a bear fur hat, he had a quiver full of arrows, a partly finished bow, an unusually ornate copper axe, he had a bag full of herbs that would be used for medicinal purposes, charcoal that was wrapped up in a fabric that he could use to start a fire. And yet, and he was very well fed. His last meal was a mix of wheat, red deer, and ibex. So he was kind of a survivalist in every sense of the word, right? He was prepared for anything. And yet he died alone at 10,000 feet with no settlements nearby. And for years, scientists struggled to understand what could have possibly happened to Otzi. There was some evidence that he suffered from brain hemorrhaging, so they thought maybe he fell while he was hiking, right? But other evidence didn't really support that theory. He didn't have any broken arms or broken legs, broken fingers, nothing like that would suggest that he was the victim of a fall. Another possibility is that he was the victim of a violent conflict. And there's some evidence to support this theory. On his, I think it was his left hand, he had a large gash that looked like it was a defensive wound, perhaps from a dagger blade. However, this wound was really too small to have been a cause of death. He wouldn't have bled out from it. And so for years, researchers were really just unsure why this man who seemed so prepared to survive in the wilderness died in the wilderness. And then about 10 years after his discovery, a new X-ray analysis revealed his cause of death. In his lower left shoulder, just below his collarbone, they found an arrowhead. He'd been shot in the back. He'd been murdered. And scientists are still discovering lots about Otzi as time goes on. For example, we now know that he had the blood of at least 4 different people on his weapons and on his clothing at his time of death. And the current consensus is that he was the victim of a brutal murder. It's clear, though, that he wasn't just a victim. He fought back. He had the defensive wound on his hand. And the fact that there were no settlements nearby suggests that maybe he was chased off, and a band of men maybe chased him and eventually got him with an arrow in the back. It's also possible, though, that Otzi was the aggressor himself. Maybe he was a parasite, a psychopathic sort of parasite living off of a local village and tormenting them. And when people finally caught on, maybe he tried to escape, and a band of local men chased him into the mountains. We'll probably never know what actually happened to Otzi, But what we do know is that he is possibly the oldest true crime case in history, at least the oldest that we're aware of, because we have no idea what happened to him, and we don't know if he was the killer himself or if he was perhaps a victim of a group of killers or a band of killers. But the fact that he was involved in a cold case, essentially, makes his story all the more fascinating to us. Once people discovered that he had this arrow in his back, people became very interested in Otzi after that. They wanted to know what happened to him. Was he the killer? If he was, what was he doing to deserve this? If he was the victim, who were these other men that had chased him out? Did other things like this happen 5,000 years ago? So for the remainder of the talk, we'll explore that. What is our fascination with true crime? What is it about hearing a story about a killer who goes on a rampage or victims of someone who has been murdered by a serial killer that really grabs our attention? But before we talk about true crime, we first need to talk about human aggression. So I came across a realization about a year ago that kind of led me down this path of thinking more about this. And that realization was that it's really remarkable that humans don't impulsively kill each other more often. And I don't say that because I'm a cynic or because I think people are terrible, nothing like that. It's just that we find ourselves in tight spaces with total strangers a lot, whether that is at a crowded pit of a concert or standing shoulder to shoulder on a city bus, or being trapped in an aluminum can 30,000 feet in the air as you fly over the ocean. We often find ourselves in tight quarters with total strangers. And incidents happen from time to time, but millions of these instances occur every single day all across the world with relatively few acts of impulsive aggression. And we take that for granted, but that is a really peculiar thing for a primate to do. Evolutionary anthropologist Sarah Hrdy once remarked that if you put a bunch of chimpanzees on a plane and flew them to even just an hour away, it would be a miracle if any of them survived the flight unmaimed. By the time the plane touched down, the aisles would be flowing with blood and severed body parts, because it's really unusual to put a bunch of strangers in the animal kingdom together, trap them, and then put them together for a long period of time. But in humans, it's something that we do all the time. So we have fairly low what's called reactive aggression. We're not very reactively aggressive. You see it come out sometimes in things like bar fights. That's a good example of reactive aggression kind of coming out in humans, or impulsive aggression. But in general, we have much lower levels of reactive aggression than other animals, and including our primate relatives. So let's take chimpanzees, for example. So chimpanzees, their social structure is generally organized along a hierarchy that is enforced through violence. Right? It's generally the larger, stronger, more reactively aggressive chimpanzees that are higher ranked, and the weaker, less reactively aggressive chimpanzees that are lower ranked. And this works really well to maintain and stabilize their hierarchy. So if a chimpanzee of a lower rank does something to transgress against a chimpanzee of a higher rank, the chimpanzee of the higher rank will respond with quick, impulsive aggression or reactive aggression. And they do this because it works really well. Human hierarchies, however, don't really follow that trajectory. Oops, one wrong way. There we go. So why would that be? Why would we have lower reactive aggression? Well, this is a picture of Richard Wrangham, who's a biological anthropologist at Harvard. And he's argued that humans have low levels of reactive aggression because we've domesticated ourselves, which sounds a little strange. But if you think about it, we domesticated wolves, and we took essentially a very reactively aggressive creature, and over thousands of generations, tamed it or domesticated it into a less reactively aggressive creature that we now keep in our homes. And Wrangham argues that we domesticated ourselves by killing off overly aggressive males who were reactively aggressive in the past, which sounds kind of paradoxical. How do you get rid of violent aggression if you use violent aggression to kill the violent aggressors? Hence the name of his book, The Goodness Paradox. So how could that possibly be, right? Well, Wrangham argues that this can happen because there are two kinds of aggression. We've already talked about reactive aggression. This is the kind that most animals, for example, the chimpanzee has. It's kind of a hot, impulsive aggression that's in response to a perceived transgression or a perceived threat. But there's another kind of aggression called proactive aggression. And proactive aggression, or premeditated aggression, is a more cold type of aggression. It's something that can happen in response to a perceived threat, but doesn't have to be. And it never happens in the moment. the aggression always comes later, after the individual has gone off, plotted, planned, tried to think about strategic ways to get back at the individual who harmed them. And strategic planning has massive advantages when it comes to aggression, because a smaller individual can overcome a stronger individual if they catch them off guard or if they cooperate with others to get back at them. And humans, we instinctively sort of separate these different kinds of aggression. So if you take the United States justice system, for example, if you commit a murder that is the result of proactive aggression, right, it's premeditated, you can be convicted of first-degree murder. And in the United States, first-degree murder is subject to the harshest possible punishment. So you can be convicted to life in prison without parole, or you can be convicted to death. Now, if you commit a murder that is the result of reactive aggression, you acted impulsively in the moment and you killed someone, you'll still be punished harshly, but not the same as someone who committed proactive aggression that led to murder. You can be convicted of second-degree murder or manslaughter, but these carry sentences of several years to maybe several decades in prison, often with the possibility of parole, and there's no possibility of being sentenced to death. That's reserved only for people who commit proactive aggression that leads to murder. Now, the distinction between these two kinds of aggression goes deeper than just our justice system. It's actually rooted deep within our biology. And that's not to say that social and contextual environmental factors don't influence this. They certainly do. But these two types of aggression are mediated by different areas of the brain. So neurobiologist Adrian Rain, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, has conducted some really fascinating work where he scans the brain of convicted killers, because what better way to learn about aggression than study convicted killers? And what he did is he took several hundred convicted murderers and he categorized them as either having been convicted of a reactively aggressive murder, so those who committed maybe second-degree murder, let's say, and those who committed a more premeditated or proactively aggressive murder, those who were convicted of first-degree murder. And then he, of course, scanned the brains of people who were controls who had not been convicted of murder. And what he found was that those who had been convicted of murder for reactive aggression had lower levels of activity in the prefrontal cortex areas of their brain. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the prefrontal cortex, among other things, is involved in mediating impulsivity and planning and forethought. The brains of murderers generally, compared to the controls, had higher levels of activity in the limbic regions of the brain, which, again, among other things, mediate emotional responses, including anger and rage. So murderers tended to have higher levels of activity in the parts of the brain associated with emotional responses like anger and rage, and those who committed reactive murder were more likely to have lower levels of activity in the areas of the brain that mediated impulsivity. Now, why is this important? Well, if you have different neural substrates for these two different kinds of aggression, this means that over time, natural selection can act on different neural substrates and actually select for tendencies for a species to become more proactively aggressive or more reactively aggressive, or less of either one. And that seems to be what happened in our species. So for a significant portion of hominid evolutionary history, so if you look back hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, human ancestors, their social organization was much like that of chimpanzees. It was largely dominated by larger, more formidable males who could enforce their social rank through reactive aggression. But then something happened around 300,000 or so years ago. Of course, the dates are a little bit in flux, but around 300,000 years ago, humans began to have the ability to plan and think and discuss those plans with others. So they developed a fairly matured language, or the ability for language. And what language does is it allows you to cooperate much better than if you're cooperating on your own, or if you are cooperating on your own, it allows you to think into the future and imagine how you might do something. So now, individuals or groups of individuals could plan and plot and conspire against these reactively aggressive males and actually overthrow them. And there's evidence of this both through the symbolic record, like through symbolic art, but also through physiological changes in the skeleton and changes associated with domestication of other species. We also see it happen in the human species around 300,000 years ago. So reactively aggressive males no longer had this pure dominion kind of over their group. And this is kind of the conclusion of Wrangham's book, that we used proactive aggression to overthrow reactively aggressive males, and in our species, this led to a shift in the type of aggression that humans have. Now that led to a lot of positive things. It led to an increase in cooperation. It led to a decrease in reactive aggression and sort of bullies in social groups. But it also led to an increase in the propensity for cold and calculated murder, because that's exactly what these individuals were doing. And this brought up a new challenge for humans to solve, because in the past, every person that you interacted with who was aggressive was reactively aggressive. We had never actually interacted with people who would plot a murder in their minds. So reactively aggressive males tend to signal their aggression, and this is true not just in humans, but also in other primate species and other species generally, because it's good to not get into fights, even if you're big and strong, because something can still happen, right? And so there's kind of an equilibrium that occurs such that larger, stronger individuals convey that in certain kinds of ways that other people recognize or other animals recognize. So reactively aggressive humans, for example, tend to have short tempers. They lash out easily in response to anger or transgressions. They behave dominantly in social situations. And in fact, you might even be able to think in your mind, what does this person look like if you're to envision a reactively aggressive male? Well, it turns out people are actually in some agreement about this. Males with higher facial width-to-height ratios are perceived by others to be more reactively aggressive. And those perceptions seem to be accurate. Those who have higher facial width-to-height ratios also self-report being more aggressive, behaving more dominantly in social situations. And that seems to bear out in experimental studies and behavioral studies where they actually compete more aggressively. And you can even see this in sports. So hockey is one sport where reactive aggression is seen as permissible at certain times. Fighting is like a key part of excitement at hockey games. But of course it lands some players in the penalty box. And now what do you think the players in the penalty box look like? Well, of course someone has studied this because it's a great idea for a study. And they found that players who had more penalty minutes in hockey actually had higher facial width-to-height ratios than those who had fewer levels of penalty minutes for fighting. So in other words, you can see the tendency for reactive aggression in the face, in addition to the behaviors that they exhibit. And we're well adapted to that. We're very well adapted to spotting that. Study after study shows that, at least in perception studies, you perceive higher facial width-to-height ratio males as being more reactively aggressive. Now, when we had this shift from reactive to proactive aggression, we had this new problem. We could no longer just look at someone's face or how they behaved in a social situation and understand whether or not they would be a potential threat. It was no longer worn on the bone structure of their face, right? Their aggression was actually hidden, festering behind their minds, waiting for the right time to strike. So premeditated murders or proactive aggression is calculated. It occurs at a specific place, at a specific time, for a specific reason. And they're plots that are kind of hatched in the minds of these violent people, right? And in about 90% of cases in violent males. So a broad face and social dominance might still tip you off to the reactively aggressive males that were around, but they were few and far between compared to how they used to be. We now had to be curious about what was going on in the minds of people, right? We had to be curious about the kinds of things that might indicate that someone would behave in a proactively aggressive way. And this desire to understand the minds of people who indulge in their murderous fantasies can be almost irresistible. In fact, it's the desire that underlies the popularity of true crime. However, this thirst to understand this is not it's not a modern phenomenon. So the genre of true crime has maybe been around 20 years, maybe as a specific genre, but stories of proactively aggressive people have been around since people have been telling stories. Early versions of what we would today recognize as a true crime story were sung in medieval ballads, told in stories around the campfire. And it wasn't long after the invention of the printing press that these true crime-like stories began to be printed. So sensational and graphic stories of murder filled the pages of pamphlets beginning in the 1500s. One early example of this is Lutheran minister Burkhard Waldes, who in 1551 published this story of how a mother savagely murdered her 4 children. And the English translation here reads, This is just a section of it. She first went for the eldest son, attempting to cut off his head. He quickly to the window sped, to try if he could creep outside. By the legs she pulled him back inside, and threw him down on the ground. He got up and away he did bound. Now the story continues, and it describes in great detail the scenes that unfold in this house and how the children failed to escape their mother. And readers devoured these details despite knowing the outcome when they first started the story. And they knew the outcome because the title is overly descriptive. It's called A True and Most Horrifying Account of How a Woman Tyrannically Murdered Her 4 Children and Then Herself. So readers went into the story knowing what was going to happen, but they still loved it. And so with access to vivid details of how this woman murdered her children and how her children failed to escape, readers could imagine for themselves what they would have done differently in that situation. So would they have been able to escape their tyrannical, murderous mother, or would she have hacked them to bits in the cellar as well? Now, as with all medieval illustrations, I have no idea what's going on in this one. But my understanding is that this is one of the earliest stories, this was in the late 1500s, where the true crime stories, or the stories of murder, began to shift from just being very detailed descriptions of the scenes to actually trying to understand the psychology or the motivations of the actual killer. So this more psychologically centered version of the true crime story arose in the English ballads around the late 1500s. And so the focus of the story, again, shifted from this very descriptive focus on the scenes themselves to this focus on why the killer did what he did, or what had happened in their past that would have caused them to do this. And over the past several hundred years, the true crime genre has become more and more refined, especially as people have become more literate. And advances in psychology and scientific understandings of human behavior now allow us to actually explain some of these things. And the fact that we can now explain it means that the public hungers more and more for that kind of information. So the structure of modern living has also likely played a role in the rise in true crime's popularity and the allure of kind of the dangerous man next door. Because for nearly all of human history, people knew all of their neighbors. They lived in very small communities, which means that the aspects of our mind that evolved to deal with social contexts or social situations evolved in the context of small communities. Your neighbors were family members or close friends, and you would often hunt and gather and feast and engage in communal rituals with them on a daily basis. So you knew them very well. Now, strangers certainly existed. We would trade with strangers, right? But they weren't seen as members of our group, and they were often met with caution and skepticism because their intentions were unknown. And certainly, they did not make up the majority of people around you like they do in a modern city. So as populations grew, people in many places of the world began moving in closer and closer proximity to strangers than their ancestors could have ever imagined. And today, many of us are surrounded by people we don't know at all. I imagine many of you, even though you're at a university, don't know many of the people in this room. I don't know any of you. And we deal with this much better than our playmate cousins would have, or even than our ancestors might have, right? We generally give people the benefit of the doubt that they're going to follow the social norms of society, even in a big multicultural city where people have different beliefs and come from different backgrounds. So crammed trains and fully booked restaurants largely exist without descending into chaos. However, the potential of the dangerous man next door still lurks in the backs of our minds. Most of us don't automatically assume that a stranger on the street is a serial killer, but sometimes his behavior might have us wondering if maybe he has some bodies buried under his basement. So for those of you that don't know, this is a Google image, a street image of Rex Heuermann, who is now convicted, or well, not convicted yet, but on trial for being a serial killer in the US, in New York. And I guess someone had found just an image of him on Google Maps hanging out and chatting amongst some strangers. Obviously, none of these people knew that he had murdered dozens of women. He was like a fairly well-known local architect. So just to kind of summarize that very winding story, for most of our evolutionary history, human ancestors dealt with reactively aggressive males. And so they evolved to signal their aggression, and we evolved to detect that. So we knew who had the tendency to be reactively aggressive, and we knew how to behave around them, we knew how to identify them. Then, once language comes onto the scene and becomes more structured, humans develop the ability to strategically plan and actually can overthrow these reactively aggressive males, which resulted in a huge social shift in the way that human societies are organized. And one of the major impacts of that social shift is that proactively aggressive people now existed and kind of lurked among us. And this led to, or to deal with this threat rather, humans had to become curious about the minds of dangerous people and about what would make someone engage in their proactive aggression or engage in it in a non-cooperative way. And the only way to learn about a proactively aggressive person is really to hear a story about it after the fact, right? Because they are intentionally hiding their intentions from you. They're not showing you who they really are. And so you kind of have to wait for something to happen and then go and read the story or listen to the story, watch the TV show, and try to pick up on clues as to why they did what they did and what were the clues that other people missed. And so this newly developed curiosity about the minds of dangerous people led to a demand for stories about these kinds of people through oral stories, written stories, eventually audiovisual stories about planned murders. In other words, about the essence of the true crime genre. And I believe that is all I have, and I would be happy to take questions or discuss.